My name is Sergeant Harper Doss. I am 28 years old. I am a combat medic in the United States Army, and 10 hours after I landed back on American soil from a 14-month deployment, my mother stood in front of a fireplace and told me I had ruined every Christmas since the day I was born. Let me start at the beginning. Not the beginning of that morning. The beginning of everything. I want you to picture this first, though, because it's the image that stayed with me the longest. 6:40 a.m., December 25th. I am still in my ACUs. I hadn't even unpacked my duffel bag yet. My mother, Diane Doss, reached up to the mantel of the fireplace my grandfather built with his own hands, and she tore down the Christmas stocking my grandmother had embroidered with my name in red thread 20 years ago. She held it over the flame for exactly as long as it took me to realize what she was doing, and then she let it go. "You have ruined every Christmas since the day you were born," she said. Her voice wasn't loud. That was the strange part. She said it the way you'd read a grocery list. My father, Gary, stepped forward and pushed my own duffel bag into my chest, hard enough that I stumbled back into the wall. He didn't look at my face. He looked at a spot just above my left shoulder, like he was reporting to a superior officer he was ashamed of. "Pack the rest of it and go," he said. His hands were shaking. I noticed that before I noticed anything else. 3 years of silence between us, and this was the most words he'd said to me since I enlisted. My sister Brooke was already filming. 23 years old, phone held vertical, ring light practically glowing off her face in the dark living room. "Hey besties, this is real, this is actually happening," she said into the camera, and then she turned toward me just long enough to catch my face in frame. "Good luck out there, soldier girl. Yes, Uncle Sam can take care of you now, because we're done." I didn't cry. I want to tell you that plainly, because it matters for what comes later. I have been trained to hold a line under fire. I have held pressure on a wound, while a 19-year-old private screamed my name and a sound of rotors got farther away instead of closer. I know how to be still when everything in me wants to break. So I picked up the small cedar box my grandfather had given me 9 years earlier, the one I carried through 2 deployments and never once opened, and I walked out into the snow in my boots. Because unlike some people in this story, I am never without my boots. I got in my car. I did not know where I was going. I only knew I was not going to fall apart in that driveway where they could watch. Let me take you back, not to that morning, to the man who built the house I was standing in front of when the door closed behind me. My grandfather's name was Walter Doss. Everyone who knew him called him Walt. Fewer people, now, call him what he was for 2 years of his life, Sergeant First Class Walter Doss, United States Army, 1968 to 1970, Republic of Vietnam. He came home in 1970 to a town called Cedar Falls, Michigan, a place with 1 stoplight and a lake that froze so hard in January you could drive a truck across it if you were foolish enough to try. He didn't talk about the war. Not once, not to my mother when she was young, not to me until I was 17 and had already signed my own enlistment papers. At which point he sat me down in his workshop and told me exactly 4 things about it and then never spoke of it again. He built cabinets. That was his trade for 40 years, out of a 1-room shop behind the house he built himself in 1968 with lumber he'd bought on credit and framed with his own hands before the roof was even on. The shop smelled like cedar shavings and sawdust and the burnt coffee sitting in a percolator older than my mother. He had a leather apron with a scorch mark on the right side from a coal that had jumped out of the wood stove one winter. He never replaced the apron. He said the burn meant it had earned its keep. Here is the part of the story that took me the longest to understand, and the part I need you to understand before anything else makes sense. My grandfather came home from Vietnam, and he was not the same man who left. Nobody used the words post-traumatic stress disorder in 1970. There wasn't a name for what he had. There was just a man who sometimes disappeared into his shop for entire days and didn't speak, a man who woke up at 3 a.m. some nights and stood at the back door listening to nothing, a man who flinched at the sound of a truck backfiring on Route 9 and then pretended he hadn't. My mother grew up watching her father be present in the house and absent everywhere it counted. He didn't miss her birthdays because he didn't love her. He missed them because some days the walls of his own skull were louder than anything happening in the kitchen. She was 7 years old. She didn't have the language for that. All she had was the feeling of it, the feeling of being a child standing outside a locked door, knocking, and never being entirely sure anyone on the other side heard her. I'm not telling you this to excuse what happened to me. What happened to me does not have an excuse. but it has an origin, and I think origins matter, because without them, cruelty just looks like a mystery, and mysteries don't teach you anything. This one does. By the time I came along, something in my grandfather had settled. Age does that to some men if they're lucky, if the war finally lets go of a little of its grip. He found, in me, a kind of quiet he recognized. I didn't talk much as a kid. I liked to work with my hands. I liked sanding wood until the grain came up smooth under my palm. He used to say, "Sandpaper goes with the grain, sweetheart, always with the grain." People are the same way. You fight against what they are, you tear them up, you work with what's already there, you can build something. He said it so many times it stopped sounding like advice and started sounding like scripture. My mother watched him love me the way she had always wanted to be loved, and something in her curdled. She has never said this to me in those words. I only understand it now, looking back, piecing it together the way you piece together a wound track from the entry and exit points. She wasn't jealous of a child. She was grieving, in a twisted, unprocessed way, the father she never got. And I was standing right there getting him instead. When I was 17, I told my parents I was enlisting. My father said nothing, which was his answer to everything. My mother went pale and then furious in the space of about 4 seconds. The army already teased my father from me for 2 years and gave me back a stranger, she said. And now it's going to take you too. I didn't understand, at 17, that she wasn't afraid for me. She was afraid of losing another person into the same silence that had swallowed her childhood. It came out as rage instead of fear, the way it so often does in people who were never taught the difference. At a Memorial Day cookout the year I turned 20, my mother slapped me across the face in front of 15 guests because she believed, wrongly, that I had let my little cousin drop and crack the glass display case holding my grandfather's Purple Heart. I hadn't touched it. I said so. She slapped me anyway, hard enough to leave a mark, and denounced to the yard that I had always been careless with things that mattered to this family. My grandfather walked over from the grill without a word, put a hand flat between my shoulder blades and steered me into the kitchen. He filled a dish towel with ice and held it to my cheek himself, the way you tend a wound in the field. Pressure, elevation, don't look away from it. Don't cry in front of her, he said quietly. Save it. Save everything. You're a soldier now. Soldiers ration what they've got left for the fight that actually matters. The next afternoon, he called me out to the shop. He was standing at the workbench with a small wooden box in his hands, cedar, 12 inches long, 8 wide, 5 tall, dovetailed corners, a thin border of cherry inlay along the lid, burned into the top with the tip of an old soldering iron, for Harper, DOS, 2017. He held it out flat across both palms like he was passing me something alive. Don't open this, he said. Just carry it. Anytime, any reason, any hour. I kept that box at the bottom of my rucksack for 9 years, through basic, through 2 deployments, through every move I made. I never once looked inside. There's one more thing about my grandfather you need to know before we go any further, because it explains everything that happened after he died. His oldest friend in the world was a man named Frank Delgado. In 1969, outside a village whose name I will not put in this story because it isn't mine to give away, my grandfather's platoon walked into an ambush. Frank Delgado took shrapnel in both legs and went down in open ground under fire. My grandfather went back for him, not because an order told him to, but because that's what you do. That's the only rule that has ever actually mattered to men like him. And he carried Frank nearly 2 miles through hostile terrain to a landing zone under fire for most of it. With Frank's blood soaking through both of their uniforms, Frank Delgado kept his legs. He came home. He built a life in Cedar Falls not far from my grandfather, and the two of them stayed close for the next 55 years, in the particular quiet way men from that generation stay close. Not many words, just showing up. Frank became the branch manager of the Cedar Falls Veterans Credit Union. And in the summer of 2016, my grandfather walked into Frank's office, closed the door, and asked him for something that would take Frank 9 years to finish carrying out. My grandfather did not tell a single member of my family what he did next. He told exactly 2 other people, Frank Delgado and a lawyer named Helen Marsh, whose office sat 2 doors down from the credit union on Front Street. In August of 2016, 2 months after my mother slapped me at that cookout, though I don't think that timing is a coincidence and neither did Helen Marsh, who told me so herself later, my grandfather walked into Helen's office and asked her one question. Could he put the house and the land in his granddaughter's name without his daughter ever finding out? Helen told him yes and explained exactly how. A revocable living trust with himself as the initial trustee, Frank Delgado named as successor trustee, and me, Harper Lynn Doss, named as sole beneficiary. He would retain what's called a life estate, the legal right to live in the house until he died. But the underlying title, the actual ownership, would belong to the trust, and the trust would belong to me. He signed the trust documents in Helen's office with a pen, properly notarized, dated, and witnessed the way the law requires. I want to be clear about that, because there is nothing hidden or improper about the paperwork itself. What he kept in his shirt pocket that day, and what he showed Helen before he signed anything, was an old carpenter's pencil he carried since Vietnam. He held it up and said, "I want to hold this in my hand while I say the words out loud, even if I have to sign with something else." Helen let him do it. Some rituals aren't about the law. They're about a man needing to feel, one more time, like the tools of his own hands were part of a decision that mattered. Under Michigan law, when a revocable trust becomes irrevocable, which happens automatically the moment the person who created it dies, the successor trustee is required to notify the beneficiary within a set window of time. Frank Delgado did exactly that, twice. He mailed formal notice by certified letter to the address on file, which was a 192 Birchwood Lane, my grandfather's house, the house I no longer lived in by then, but the house my parents did. Both letters were addressed to me. Both were delivered to that house. Neither one ever reached me. My mother collected the mail every day. I did not know this, not until Frank told me himself, sitting across the desk with his hands folded, his voice low and careful, like a man delivering a diagnosis he wished he didn't have to give. She had opened both letters. She had read them, and she had thrown them away and told no one, and gone on living in a house she now knew with absolute legal certainty did not belong to her. That single fact changes everything else in this story. It means what happened to me on Christmas morning wasn't the accumulated carelessness of a woman who never learned how to love her own child. It was a decision made with full knowledge by a woman who understood exactly what she was risking and chose to gamble that I would never find out either. My grandfather also opened what's called a payable on death account at the credit union in 2020, naming me as the sole beneficiary. $92,000 built up slowly over 4 years from commission work, custom cabinetry and gun cases he built for other veterans in 3 counties, cash jobs he never told my grandmother or my mother about. Deposited a little at a time every spring, the ledger note Frank showed me in my grandfather's own handwriting for the year she'll need it. He never touched his military pension for this. He never touched a cent that belonged to my grandmother's memory. He built it, board by board, the same way he built everything else in his life, and every single year on the morning after Christmas, because Frank told him plainly that no federal credit union in the state of Michigan opens its doors on Christmas Day itself, federal holiday doors locked. And my grandfather had laughed and said, "Then we'll make it the 26th. Frank Delgado drove to the branch alone an hour before opening and sat in his office with the lights off waiting. 9 Decembers in a row. Just in case, because he had told his oldest friend he would, and because the man who said it had once carried him 2 miles under fire without being asked. I think about that a lot. 9 years of a man giving up part of his own Christmas morning for a promise he might never have to keep. My grandfather died in October of the year before this story starts. Not pancreatic cancer. His heart finally gave out, weakened over decades by exposure to Agent Orange during his service. The kind of slow-motion casualty that the VA now officially recognizes, but that took my grandfather most of his life to earn recognition for. He was 79. At the funeral, my mother cried harder than anyone in the room. She stood near the casket, accepting condolences with one hand pressed flat against her chest, and I watched. I didn't understand what I was watching. Then I only understood it later. Her eyes drift more than once toward the bookshelf in his study where he kept his important papers. She was already doing the math. She hadn't even taken off her coat. Now you know everything that was happening underneath the morning I described at the start. Let me walk you through it properly. I had landed at Grand Rapids 2 days before Christmas, off a flight from a deployment that had run 14 months instead of the 9 we'd been told to expect. I hadn't slept more than 4 hours at a stretch in longer than I could remember. I drove straight to Cedar Falls because it was the only address I had. the only place that had ever, in any version of my life, resembled home. I didn't know yet that it legally was my home. I only knew it was the house with my grandfather's smell still faintly in the walls, cedar and shellac, even a year after he died. My mother let me in on the 23rd with a tight smile and an even tighter hug, the kind where you can feel the person counting the seconds until it's socially acceptable to stop. My father barely spoke to me over dinner. I told myself it was because I'd been gone so long. I have since learned to be suspicious of every explanation I give myself that requires other people to be kinder than they've shown themselves to be. On the night of the 24th, I came downstairs near midnight for water and heard my parents' voices low in the dark kitchen. After tomorrow, my mother said, it's just going to be our real family, finally. My father didn't argue. He never argued. I heard him rinse a glass in the sink and set it down, and I went back upstairs before either of them saw me on the stairs. I lay in the dark of the room that used to be mine and took the cedar box out of my rucksack for the first time in months. I set it on the nightstand. I looked at the burned letters on the lid for Harper. DOS, 2017. And I did not open it. Something in me still believed, at 28 years old, in a soldier's discipline about promises. Don't open the box until you actually need what's inside it. I told myself I didn't need it yet. I slept maybe 3 hours. At 6:32 the next morning, I woke to the sound of too many footsteps in the hallway. By 6:40, I was standing in front of a fireplace watching my own name burn. I told you already what happened next. The stalking my father's hands, my sister's phone, the sentence my mother had apparently been saving up for 28 years and had finally found the nerve or the excuse to say out loud. I want to add one detail I left out before, because I think it matters. As my father pushed the duffel bag into my chest, I saw his hands shake, not from anger. I know what anger looks like in a man's hands. I've held pressure on wounds inflicted by angry men. I know the difference between a shove that comes from rage and one that comes from something closer to grief. His hand shook the way a hand shakes when it's doing something the rest of the body doesn't agree with. It was the first time he had touched me in 3 years, and it was to push me out a door. I don't think that absolves him. I think it explains him. My father had wanted to enlist himself back in the 80s and failed the physical on a heart murmur nobody ever properly diagnosed. He married my mother 2 years later and spent the rest of his life, I think, quietly believing he hadn't measured up to the men in this family, to my grandfather, and eventually to me. A man who believes that about himself gets very good at doing what he's told and very bad at doing what's right. I didn't cry in that driveway. I got in my car in my boots because a soldier does not leave a building without her boots on, whatever else has just happened to her, with the cedar box on the passenger seat, and I drove. I did not go to the credit union that morning. I want to be honest about that because I know some versions of this kind of story have people walking straight into a bank on Christmas morning and finding the doors open and a manager waiting. And I need you to know that isn't what happened to me because that isn't how the world actually works, and my grandfather knew that better than anyone. I drove 40 minutes to a highway motel outside Traverse City. I paid cash for one night. I sat on the edge of a bed that smelled like industrial detergent, and I called my unit's readiness NCO because that's a habit the Army puts in you. When something goes sideways, you report it, even to yourself. I didn't call my captain. Not yet. I lay awake most of the night with the cedar box sitting on the nightstand of a room that wasn't mine, in a town that no longer felt like it belonged to me either. At 7:58 the next morning, December 26th, I pulled into the parking lot of the Cedar Falls Veterans Credit Union 10 minutes before it opened for regular business on an ordinary Friday. The way any credit union in the state of Michigan actually operates. I sat in my car with the heater running and the box in my lap. I opened it for the first time in 9 years. The smell that came up was cedar, faint and dry, the smell of a shop I hadn't stood in for almost a decade. Inside were 4 things. The first was a brass front door key, worn smooth in a way new keys never are, tied to a leather tag. On the tag, in my grandfather's handwriting, front door, 1968. The second was a folded scrap of yellow legal paper, smaller than my palm, the pencil on it not faded at all, any time, any reason, any hour. The third was a business card. Cedar Falls Veterans Credit Union. Frank Delgado, branch manager. On the back, in my grandfather's hand, tell Frank you're Walt's granddaughter. He'll know exactly what that means. The fourth was a photograph, black and white, the edges soft with age. My grandfather, younger than I'd ever seen him look in a photograph, standing at the edge of the tree line behind the house, holding a baby wrapped in an olive drab wool blanket that I recognized. It was the one that still sat folded in the cedar chest at the foot of his bed. On the back, in pencil, May 3rd, the day I was born. I sat in that parking lot with the engine running and the heater blowing, and I cried for the first time in 14 months. Not loud. I am not a loud crier. 2 minutes, maybe 3, with my hands still on the wheel like I might need to drive somewhere at any second. Then I put the photograph back in the box and I walked inside. The lobby of the credit union was small and warm. A real Christmas tree in the corner still up from the holiday. 2 tellers behind the counter. I set the business card down and said, "My grandfather told me to ask for Frank Delgado. I'm his granddaughter." The teller looked at the card, looked at me, at my uniform, still creased from a duffel bag, at whatever was written on my face, and picked up the phone without a word. Frank Delgado came out of a back office less than a minute later. He was somewhere in his late 70s, broad-shouldered even now, wearing a cardigan with a VFW pin on the lapel. He stopped a few feet from me and said, "You're Harper," and it wasn't a question. "Yes, sir. Bring the box," he said, and turned before I could answer, because he'd already seen it under my arm. His office had a wooden desk I recognized instantly. My grandfather had built it, the same joinery, the same grain pattern. I'd sanded 100 pieces like it as a kid. On the wall was a photograph of 2 much younger men in fatigues, arms slung over each other's shoulders, grinning like the war hadn't happened yet, or like it already had, and they'd decided to grin anyway. Frank closed the door. He didn't lock it. I want to correct that detail plainly because banks in this country don't lock customers into private meetings, and neither did Frank. He simply closed it, sat down across from me, and folded his hands. "Your grandfather has been waiting 9 years for this morning," he said. "So have I." "Open the box. Show me." I did. He looked at the 4 objects the way you look at an old friend's handwriting. He picked up the key and turned it in the light. "He carried this on his belt for 56 years, Frank said. "Had a duplicate cut in 2016, kept the copy for himself. Gave the original to you, told me, and I'm quoting him now because I wrote it down that same week so I'd never get it wrong. Frank, when she walks in here with that key, you stop whatever you're doing. You take her into your office and you tell her the truth, all of it. Don't soften it for my daughter's sake." Harper's earned the truth by now, however long it takes to get to her. He opened a drawer and set down a navy folder, soft at the corners and on the front, in pencil, for Harper. "Hold until she comes in." "Sit down, Sergeant," Frank said. "What I'm about to show you is going to change everything that happened to you 2 mornings ago. Your grandfather didn't just leave you a key. He left you a way to set the record straight, on paper, and he did it quietly enough that nobody in your family knew until you needed it." He walked me through the folder page by page, the way you'd walk a new medic through a protocol, plainly in order, checking that I understood each step before moving to the next. The Revocable Living Trust, dated August 2016, notarized by Helen Marsh 2 doors down, grantor Walter Doss, successor trustee Frank Delgado, sole beneficiary Harper Lynn Doss. He kept a life estate, Frank said, the right to live in that house until the day he died. That's not unusual, and it's not a trick. It's standard practice, and it meant nothing changed in his day-to-day life. But the underlying title, from that day forward, belonged to the trust, and the trust belonged to you. He turned a page. When he passed last October, the trust converted automatically from revocable to irrevocable. Under Michigan law, that transfers the property to you by operation of law. No probate court required, because he set it up exactly this way on purpose. The day he died, Harper, that house became legally yours. He turned another page, and his voice changed, got quieter, more careful. "Here's the part I owe you a harder truth about." He slid 2 photocopied letters across the desk. Michigan law requires a successor trustee to formally notify the beneficiary within a set window after the trust becomes irrevocable. I did that twice. Certified mail both times to a 10-2 Birchwood Lane, because that was the address on file and the address where you were staying whenever you were stateside. I looked at the dates. Both letters had been sent within 4 months of my grandfather's death. Both had been addressed to me by name. "I never got these," I said. "I know," Frank said, "because your mother did." He let that sit for a second before he kept going. "She came in here 3 separate times after your grandfather passed, Harper. First time, 8 days after the funeral, asking us to release his accounts to her as next of kin. I informed her she wasn't named beneficiary on anything. She left upset. Second time, in the spring, she came in with a certified copy of your birth certificate, trying to argue the beneficiary designation should be reversed. I told her it was irrevocable and couldn't be contested without legal cause. She left upset. Third time she brought your father. Voices got raised. On her way out, she said, and one of my tellers heard this clearly enough to write it down because I asked her to, she doesn't even know. She doesn't deserve to know. I sat with that for longer than I meant to. She knew, I said finally, the whole time. She read the letters and she threw them away, and she kept living in a house that wasn't hers. And then she stood in front of a fireplace and told me I'd ruined every Christmas of my own life. Yes, Frank said, simply because there wasn't a version of that sentence that needed softening. He set down one more document, a title insurance policy, paid in full the same week the trust was signed, protecting the property against any future claim, including from family. Your grandfather thought of everything, Frank said. He always did. Man could plan a supply route through terrain he'd never seen before. Planning your future was easier for him than most things in his life. There was one more thing in the folder. A sealed envelope, my name written on the front in my grandfather's shaking, late-life handwriting, clearly written closer to the end than the rest of the paperwork. Frank told me he'd never read it. Nobody had. It had been in the folder, sealed, since the week before he died. I opened it there, in Frank's office, because I didn't think I could carry it around, unopened, the way I'd carried the box for 9 years. I'd already learned, in the space of 20 minutes, what happens when you wait too long to open the things people leave for you. The letter was short. I'm not going to give you every word of it, because some things are mine to keep whole. But I'll tell you what it said in the way that matters. He wrote that he needed me to understand something about my mother before I let myself hate her completely, because he said hatred is a weight you end up carrying on deployments where you can't afford the extra load. He told me, briefly, plainly, the way he told me everything. About the years after he came home from Vietnam, the years he wasn't fully present for her. The door she used to stand outside of as a little girl, knocking without ever being sure anyone heard. He said he never told her he was sorry for that the way he should have, not clearly enough, not often enough, and that by the time he understood what she needed to hear, something in her had already hardened around the absence of it. He said, I think when she saw me finally show up for you the way I never showed up for her, some old wound in her mistook you for the enemy instead of me. That was never fair to you. It was never your fault, and it still isn't. But I wanted you to know where it started, because a wound with no name is a wound you can't ever treat. This one has a name now. Do with it what you decide is right. That part isn't mine to choose for you. He ended it with the same 4 words that had been on that scrap of yellow paper for 9 years. Any time, any reason, any hour. I read it 3 times in Frank's office, and I did not cry again, not there. I have learned over the last several years that some things need to be carried a little farther before you can safely set them down. I called my company commander that same morning from the parking lot, because that is what you do when your world tilts sideways and you don't yet trust your own judgment to be steady. You report to someone whose job is to help you see straight. Captain Renata Cruz picked up on the second ring. I told her as plainly as I could what had happened over the last 36 hours. She didn't interrupt me once. When I finished, she was quiet for a second and then she said, You did the right thing calling me before you did anything else, Sergeant. Now here's what we're going to do. You're going to call the lawyer your grandfather already hired for exactly this situation, because it sounds like the man thought of everything, God rest him. And you're going to let her do her job. And in the meantime, you are not walking into that house alone to confront anybody. We don't leave people to fight their hardest battles solo, and that includes you, off the clock, out of uniform, on leave. Understood? Understood, ma'am. And Sergeant, I'm glad you're all right, whatever all right means this week. That call mattered more to me than I expected it to. I'd spent 28 years being told, in one way or another, by the people who share my blood, that I was a burden, a disappointment, a thing to be managed rather than a person to be looked after. And here was a woman I'd known for 2 years, from a completely different life, telling me, without hesitation, that nobody in her formation gets left to handle the hardest day of their life by themselves. It is a strange thing to learn what family is supposed to feel like from people who share none of your DNA. Helen Marsh, the lawyer, met me at her office that same afternoon. It turned out my grandfather hadn't stopped at the trust. He'd asked her back in 2016 to also prepare and keep on file, updated every couple of years, the paperwork for what Michigan law calls an unlawful detainer action, the legal process for removing someone who is occupying a property without the legal right to do so. He told her plainly, if the day ever comes where my daughter has to be asked to leave that house, I don't want my granddaughter waiting months for lawyers to catch up. I want the papers ready the day she walks in needing them. That's why what happened next took weeks, not years. Helen filed the petition within days. My parents were served formal notice. There was a hearing because Michigan law requires nothing in this happened without due process, without a judge reviewing documents, without my family having every legal opportunity to contest a trust that, as it turned out, could not be contested. My mother tried. Her attorney told her, apparently in almost the same words Frank had used, that there was no legal cause to overturn an irrevocable trust executed nearly a decade earlier with full documentation and clear intent. On a Saturday morning in late March, 3 months after the fire had taken my stocking, I drove up Birchwood Lane one more time. A sheriff's deputy was waiting on the porch with a new set of keys on a brass ring. New keys because that's how the law actually works. The locks had been changed as part of the legal transfer of possession, and the old brass key my grandfather had carried for 56 years sat in my chest pocket that day, not because it opened anything anymore, but because it was the only thing in the world that still smelled faintly of his hands. "Welcome home, Sergeant Doss," the deputy said. I used the new key. I stepped inside. The house was empty. My parents had taken everything they considered theirs, which turned out to be less than they probably expected once the lawyers were done sorting out what belonged to whom. The fireplace was cold and clean. The floorboards my grandfather had laid in 1968 were still there, under a thin layer of dust, and under everything else, faint, the smell of cedar. I want to tell you what happened to my family in the months after, because I think it matters, not as punishment, but as consequence. The natural weight of choices finally landing where they'd always been headed. My parents had been living in that house rent-free for years, and it came out through my Aunt Marguerite where the money from their previous home sale had actually gone. A private school for Brooke, most of it, plus 2 vacations and a failed investment in Colton Vance's fitness apparel line that produced, as far as anyone can tell, 0 actual products. By the time they moved into a small 2-bedroom apartment across town, one with no fireplace, which my mother apparently found devastating in a way she never found the fireplace's previous occupant devastating. There wasn't much savings left standing. Brooke lost 3 brand partnerships within 2 weeks of the video going semi-viral among people who recognized, correctly, that laughing while your sister gets thrown out into the snow is not a good look for a lifestyle influencer. Colton broke up with her by text 9 days later. 9 words: "This isn't the brand I'm building. I'm out." My father sent me a text in April longer than anything he'd ever written me before. He said he should have stopped my mother 100 different times over 28 years and never once found the nerve. He said he understood now that a man who fails to act when it matters is not a neutral bystander, he's a participant. He said he wasn't asking for forgiveness, only offering the truth because it was the only thing he had left that was actually his to give. I read it more than once. I didn't reply right away. I didn't delete it either. Brooke reached out too in a way I didn't expect. Not an apology, not at first, just a message asking if I remembered the summer she was 12 and I was 17 when our mother enrolled her in 3 different enrichment programs in a single season. Voice lessons and travel soccer and some kind of pageant coaching Brooke hated but was never allowed to quit. She used to tell people I had the spark. Brooke wrote, "I don't think anyone ever asked me if I wanted to be the one who had it." I hadn't thought about it that way before. I'd spent so many years watching the money and the attention flow toward my sister that I never once considered what it might cost a person to be cast from childhood as the family's whole investment to carry. At 7 years old, the unspoken job of being enough for 2 daughters at once, it didn't make what she said to me on Christmas morning acceptable. Some things don't have an excuse, only an origin. The same way my mother's cruelty had an origin without an excuse. but it made her a person to me again, instead of just a phone held vertical in a dark living room, and I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I wanted to write back. My mother never wrote to me at all. Not one word, not that spring, not since. I think, in a strange way, that told me more clearly than any apology could have exactly how much she'd known, and exactly how little she was prepared to own it. The first week of April, I climbed the pull-down ladder into the attic with a flashlight because I hadn't been up there since I was a teenager. And something in me needed to know what was left of him in the parts of the house nobody else had thought to look. In the far corner, under the eaves, was an old military duffel bag, faded olive drab, the kind he'd have carried out of Vietnam 55 years earlier. It wasn't labeled with a name tag or a unit number. It was labeled in black marker in his handwriting, Harper. 2020. I sat down on the floorboards and opened it. Inside were 5 things. The first was a Christmas stocking. Cream wool, my name stitched along the cuff in red thread, slightly uneven the way embroidery looks when an old man with unsteady hands does it himself in the evenings without telling anyone. On the inside cuff, stitched in smaller letters, DOS. 2020. The second, third, fourth, and fifth things were more cedar boxes, exactly like the one he'd given me at 17, same dovetails, same cherry inlay. 4 backup houses, in case the first one hadn't been enough, and tucked in the very bottom of the bag, wrapped in an old olive drab undershirt, was a set of dog tags. Not mine. His. Worn smooth around the edges the way the brass key had been, a slip of paper folded inside the chain read, in pencil, for whichever year you finally need to hear this from me instead of read it. I never stopped being your first sergeant even after I put the uniform away. Nobody gets left behind. Not you. Not ever. I knelt there in the cold and the dust, and I held that stocking against my chest, and for the first time since I was a small girl learning to stop crying in front of my mother, I cried the way you cry when you're not afraid of being heard. Because he had been making me a new stocking in the evenings with unsteady hands, in the same years my mother was rehearsing a different sentence about me for every Christmas that came. He had been 1 floor below all of it, working in silence, building me a Christmas that didn't depend on her permission to exist. Every single time she told me I had ruined every Christmas since I was born, he had already been quietly proving her wrong, 1 stitch at a time, without ever telling me he was doing it. I carried the duffel bag down from the attic. I hung the new stocking on the mantel where the old one had burned. I lined the 4 spare cedar boxes up on the workbench in the corner where I could see them every day. The way you keep spare parts in a field kit, not because you expect to need all of them, but because a soldier who's been caught without a backup once doesn't make that mistake twice. I pulled his workbench out of the corner and set it back in the middle of the room, the way it had stood when I was small enough to need a stool to reach it. I laid his chisels out in size order, the way he taught me at 9 years old. I tied on the leather apron with the scorch mark because it still fit, more or less, across shoulders that have carried a rucksack for a decade. I am not a cabinet maker. I don't know if I ever will be. But I'm learning it the way he taught it, with the grain, not against it, and some evenings that's the only thing that quiets the noise deployment leaves behind in a person's head. I also want to tell you about June Alvarez because I think leaving her out would be dishonest about how I actually got through the months that followed. My unit connects soldiers coming off long deployments, especially ones dealing with sudden family upheaval with counselors at the VA as a standard part of reintegration, not because something is presumed to be wrong with you, but because coming home is its own kind of mission, and missions go better with support. June never once told me what to feel. She never diagnosed me with anything, and she was careful about that. Careful in a way I came to respect. She just asked good questions and let me find my own footing in the answers. She helped me understand something I hadn't been able to name on my own, that the discipline which makes me good at my job, hold the line, don't cry in front of the enemy, ration what you've got left, had also taught me over the years to hold a line against my own grief even when the fight was over and there was no one left to perform strength for. She didn't tell me to stop being strong. She told me strength and grief aren't actually opposites, and that a soldier who never lets herself feel anything eventually has nothing left to protect. I think about my grandfather every time she says something like that. I think about a man who came home from a war with no name for what he was carrying and who spent the rest of his life quietly and perfectly, trying to make sure the people he loved never inherited that same silence. He didn't get it right with my mother. He knew that. He said as much in the last letter he ever wrote, but he tried, in the only way he knew how, to get it right with me. 9 years in advance, one stitch and one signature at a time. June asked me once, in one of our early sessions, what I thought my grandfather would have wanted me to do with the anger. Not the grief. She was careful to separate the two because she said people often let one hide inside the other until neither gets properly tended to. Just the anger. I told her the honest answer, which was that I didn't know yet, and she said that was a perfectly acceptable place to be sitting for a while. You don't owe anyone a timeline on this, she told me. Not your mother, not your sister, not even yourself. Grief doesn't salute anybody's schedule, Sergeant, no matter how good you are at following orders everywhere else in your life. It was the first time in months someone had given me permission to be slow about something. And I didn't realize until she said it how much I'd needed to hear it from someone whose job wasn't to fix me, only to sit with me while I figured out what fixing myself might eventually look like. Renata Cruz checked in on me by phone every couple of weeks that spring, usually with no more than a single question. You eating? You sleeping? You still going out to that shop? And somehow, those 3 short questions did more for me some nights than an hour of conversation might have. There's a particular kind of care that doesn't need many words to land. My grandfather had it. Frank Delgado had it. Renata had it too, and I don't think that's a coincidence. I think it's something the Army teaches some people how to carry, the same way it taught Walter Doss 55 years ago that you go back for the man on the ground even when nobody's ordered you to. In May, I re-signed for another term of service. Renata Cruz was the first person I told, and she just nodded like she'd already known. But I also did one more thing with the house, something I don't think my grandfather ever imagined, though I like to believe he would have approved. On weekends, I opened the shop to other veterans in the county, men and women my grandfather's age, and my own people carrying versions of the same silence he carried home in 1970, before anyone had a word for it. We don't do therapy in there, not officially. We build things. Bookshelves, birdhouses, simple boxes with dovetailed corners. Sometimes nobody talks for an hour at a stretch, and that's fine because some of the most important conversations I've ever had were the ones that happened without a single word, just 2 people standing at a workbench, sanding with the grain side by side. One last thing about my grandfather, and then I'll let you go. My grandfather did not save me. People want to tell that story. The grandfather who swooped in and rescued the granddaughter from a cruel family, and I understand why it's a satisfying shape for a story to take. But it isn't quite true, and I don't want to tell it that way because I think the true version is more useful to whoever's listening. He didn't save me. He prepared a door 9 years before I needed to walk through it, and then he waited without ever telling me it was there, because he didn't want me choosing between the truth and my mother before I was ready to make that choice on my own terms. The hand that turned the doorknob on the morning of December 25th. The hand that got in the car in the snow, that drove to a motel instead of falling apart. That walked into a credit union in her boots 2 mornings later. That was mine. Soldiers aren't rescued. We're trained to find our own way back to friendly lines, even when the terrain is unfamiliar and the map is 9 years out of date. What my grandfather did, the thing only real love actually does, is the thing he did 9 years before I ever needed it. He saw what was coming. The way a good NCO reads a threat before it fully materializes, he signed a trust with a carpenter's pencil in his hand for the ritual and a pen for the law. He asked an old friend to give up part of 9 Christmas mornings, just in case. He stitched my name into wool in the evenings with unsteady hands, saying nothing to anyone. He put a key in a cedar box and told me any time, any reason, any hour, and then he lived with that promise silently for 9 years. Because he understood something about love that most people never learn in time to practice it. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone you love is prepare for their worst day quietly enough that they never have to feel like a burden while you're doing it. The world will sometimes do the math on you the way my mother did the math on me, treating you like a subtraction instead of a person, a deduction instead of a daughter. That is not love's math. Love's math is quieter than that. It's a light left on in a workshop nobody thinks to check. It's a man giving up his own Christmas morning for 9 years running because he made a promise to a friend he once carried 2 miles under fire. It's a grandfather sitting with a needle in his unsteady hands, stitching a name into wool in the years before the storm nobody else could see coming yet. Some people don't build you a door on the day you need one. They build it years in advance. They hang it exactly where you'll find it whenever you're finally ready to walk through. I'm Sergeant Harper Doss. I'm 28 years old. I live at a Tin 2 Birchwood Lane in the house my grandfather built with his own hands in 1968 and left to me, quietly, 9 years before I ever knew I'd need it. I have a fireplace. I have a stocking on the mantel with my name stitched in red thread by an old man who never once told me he was doing it. And I have a door, the one he built for me before either of us knew how badly I'd have to use it. Anytime, any reason, any hour. That was never just a note on a scrap of yellow paper. It was a promise, the same one every soldier learns to say and mean: nobody gets left behind. He kept that promise to me even after he was gone. And some nights, standing at his workbench with sawdust on my hands, I think that might be the truest thing anyone in my family ever taught me how to do.